Welcome back. Just before the break, we were talking to our distinguished guest today, Sophia Karim, an architect and an artist based in London. She was talking about architecture of disappearance. Sounds rather intriguing to me, but you probably can explain it, please.
Okay. So my theories in architecture of disappearance are a combination of my human rights work that I began with my practice in architecture. I came to the stage where I realized that if architecture is my art, then I have to live it properly, practice it fully in its fullest form. It really started with one drawing. I mentioned to you that whilst my uncle was in jail, I was trying to imagine those spaces. One cell in that jail is called the Amdani cell. Prisoners are held, it's a holding cell. And to fit the prisoners in maximum density, in minimum space, they have to configure their bodies in specific patterns. One is called Gechki file, where the men lie opposite each other, groin to groin, sort of scissor like that. Such an intimate pose. To make those drawings, I could only practice with my children to try and understand this. That's Gechki file, and they can fit. It's said up to.
It's for the fish, isn't it?
Gechki fish, yes. And it's said to hold up to 350 prisoners have been held in that way. If they pay more, they are allowed to lie in something called Ilish file. Ilish is another Bangladeshi fish. Ilish file, they get 10 inches of space each in order to lie side to side. I made many, many drawings of this. Sometimes I was drawing the bodies as proper bodies, figurative bodies. Sometimes I was abstracting them and turning them into mathematical vectors that I was modeling on the computer, turning them into geometric matter and form on the computer, making basically worlds, virtual worlds out of these body configurations. But as I drew these bodies again and again, I realized I'm not just drawing the Amdani cell, I'm drawing instances of human subjugation throughout history, torture, throughout history, past, present, and unfortunately, quite likely future. Bodies piled upon bodies, dead, alive, barely alive, the final phases of human subjugation. And it was at that point I realized that this architecture of disappearance thing began to emerge, that if architecture is an embodiment of humanity, then it must confront pain. It must confront the pain of the past, of history, and of present. And if you look at other art forms, for instance, music, literature, poetry, they have been used as a language of struggle and resistance, but architecture generally hasn't. It prefers to avoid confronting pain. So say if you think of jazz, jazz, I mean, that was born through confronting the pain of slavery. Through confronting that pain, they transformed pain and transcended and turned it to beauty. Nina Simone, when she sang about the pain of her people, it was converted and transformed into beauty. Poets have done it in literature, say Toni Morris and many. Architecture doesn't generally do that, and that's what I'm interested in.
So far, architecture was, the science of architecture, the practice of it, was being controlled and being guided by money matters, capitalists who would like you to do something that will bring them more money, make the most of their space.
Yes, exactly. Now, I think it's quite interesting because if you look at the history of architecture, I think architecture has always understood that it is linked with the human condition. Indeed, in the teaching of architecture, you learn philosophy, you learn maths, you learn many things. So say if my foundation in architecture was Western architecture. And if you look at Western architecture, do you know, say, the very famous drawing that Leonardo da Vinci did of the man with the square and the circle?
Yeah, yeah.
So Leonardo da Vinci did this drawing of a man inscribed in a square in the circle, and he was borrowing from the Roman architect Vitruvius, who also did this. And what they were telling you was that there's a relationship between the human body, geometry, proportion, and the cosmos. So they understood that there's this connection with existential issues, human existence and geometry and proportion. Similarly, Islamic architecture, its interest in geometry, it understood there's a relationship between the human condition, geometry, and an underlying reality. Minimalism, Zen,
and as you said, the entire cosmos.
The cosmos, exactly. Buddhism, Zen minimalism has also been interested in compassion, but you'll notice that they're always very abstract notions of human condition.
Yep.
They don't want to engage with the pain and the suffering on the street, not in the way that music does, not in the way that art or literature does. Architecture likes to stand back. It's quite sanitized, it's quite aloof, and of course that suits power, because power uses architecture. If you think of the pyramids, for instance, the pyramids were linked to the cosmos and those things, but slaves were building the pyramids. So I've come to a point where I now need, or I feel that it's not good enough to only think of existential, philosophical things in abstract. I need to engage it with direct action, and that's what I'm exploring.
Well, that direct action means your activism and campaigning for human rights of people who are denied that in many countries, and you think of Rohingyans, you think of Kashmiris, you think of people in Yemen, you think of people, the freedom of speech in many countries. You want to combine that with your practice, and probably you are devoting more time these days to your activism, is it?
I am, and I think it's because this won't just be me. I think many artists tend to feel we are more receptive to things that go on, have more empathy.
You're more sensitive.
Yeah, perhaps.
Most artists are very sensitive.
Sensitive, and I think for me it's not a case of why do I do that. I think I couldn't not comment on these things. If it comes to the stage where I'm silent or I'm not commenting, I may as well be dead. I have children, so when I see something that's happening in Kashmir or in Assam or what's happening to the Rohingya, I can't help but think, what if that was my child?
True.
When I was drawing those bodies piled up, I thought, what if that was my child? For me, I don't think, why do I speak out or engage in these things? I only regret that I don't do more.
You do writings, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are your writings most of the time on the same topics like human rights, and or you talk about these neoliberal ideas in architecture?
Yeah, okay. So sometimes it's on architecture. So I did a Q&A on Zaha Hadid, where I talked about neoliberalism, iconic architecture, whose needs does that kind of architecture serve, the problematic areas of migrant labour in architecture. Even in discussions on climate emergency, they've quite neatly avoided discussing migrant labour in that debate and discourse. I also write around my art. So I'll give you one example. I made an object which is a golshi. So I often make objects based on using old family garments and rice starch. So things from, say, old lungis or old sharis in my family, I cast small household objects out of those with rice starch. So one object I made was a kolshi, and I used fabric and rice starch. And I also used email printouts from email exchange I had with my aunt. And they were, a couple of years ago, I was facing Islamophobia in the UK. And a very good friend of mine, I'm still good friends with her, but she said quite hurtful comments in relation to this issue. And I'd gone home and I was upset, and I emailed my aunt, and she emailed me back, and she said, one of the things in her email she mentioned, to paraphrase Noam Chomsky, the US is a military-industrial complex. It needs wars to survive. And to wage wars, it needs demons, willingly manufactured by the Western media. Mon karab korishna, don't feel bad. So using that email and rice starch and fabrics, I
it
made
had a profound effect on your mind.
It did, and I made this golshi. And then I decided to write a political essay about this golshi. Because Keats once wrote a poem called An Ode to an Urn. And so golshi is like an urn, and I wrote a political essay called Ode to an Urn, Military-Industrial Complex. And in that essay I talked about Islamophobia, my state, as in the UK's quite duplicitous role. On the one hand saying it's fighting a war against extremism, on the other hand embracing Saudi and regimes that export extremism. So yeah, that's the kind of thing I write.
Well, whatever is convenient to me, I will do.
Yes.
And that's convenience is like that it brings money, you see.
Yeah.
Wage war.
Yeah.
Deprive people of their rights. If that suits me, that I will. Otherwise, other times, over a cup of tea or something, I will talk about human rights.
Exactly. Exactly.
And people do get away with it.
And this kind of, I mean, the war on terror and attitudes to Islam have shaped my entire adult life. So, you know, from the war in Iraq and what went on. I mean, it's interesting because we have Boris Johnson in power now, totally Islamophobic. He's openly compared Muslim women to letterboxes. No investigation happening that I can see. He's Prime Minister and he's running to be Prime Minister again and may succeed again.
Well,
yeah.
After December 12th, we will know.
Yeah.
You were involved in an exhibition at Victoria and Albert Museum?
No, it was at the Rubin Museum in New York.
What was it about?
So it's a retrospective. The exhibition is a retrospective of my uncle Shohidul Alam's entire lifetime's work. Part of
photographs?
That, yes, his photography and his institution building and his activism. So his entire career's work. One section of that exhibition is about his time in jail, and it was these small architectural models that I told you about, based on his memories and my imagination, that were presented.
Wish you had brought them here.
I know, I should have brought them, yeah.
Yeah, that would have added something to realistic, yeah.
They're in New York.
You're also in what is called a visiting critic at Westminster School.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, break time. Hello? না না আপনি ব্রেক করে দেন কারণ এটা আবার উত্তর দিতে পারবে না All right. Well, the time has come to take a break, and then when we come back, we will pick up the same thread, talking about our guest today, Sophia Karim, artist and architect. Thank you. Don't go away. We'll be back soon.